We actually invest in people to create kind of internal facing products, procedures, policies, such that they can share with pride that they no longer have to do repetitive, redundant things. There's always going to be a percentage of the folks that don't want to change. And so let me be really clear to say,
Meet Adam Paulisick, a three-time acquired serial entrepreneur and the CEO of Skilly. He is a distinguished service professor at Carnegie Mellon University School of Computer Science. He is an expert in AI and human-computer interaction, now building AI agents that onboard and train, just like real employees.
the problem is that, what used to be marketing or operations or finance is just no longer defined in those same terms. Because as wonderful as AI is to move fast, it's not about the 9 out of 10 things it gets right. It's the catastrophic one it gets wrong. What we're seeing here is not only is there change management necessary to really understand and uncover the talent in the individual, but it's the idea of how that individual is going to scale with systems that they either created or they didn't. It's no longer about substitution or replacement. It's about augmentation.
What kind of challenges, I guess, do you see in actually integrating humans with AIs in these sorts of situations?
One of the first things we think a lot about, and I've thought about doing in these integrations, is
Welcome back to another episode of the Dark Arts of Software Engineering Team Development. I'm Franz, and this is my co-host Cal Johnson. We're the founders of Hellonic, and we build engineering teams that actually function for startups by combining agile training with psychology, neuroscience, and semantics. This is our show about what really makes teams tick. Our guest today is Adam Paulisick, serial entrepreneur, 3 times acquired, which means 3 separate times somebody said, we need to buy whatever this guy built. Former chief product officer at BCG, former SVP at Nielsen, and he's been teaching entrepreneurship, AI, and human-computer interaction at Carnegie Mellon for over a decade. He lives at this intersection of product, entrepreneurship, AI, and how humans actually interact with technology, which is exactly why we wanted him on this show. Right now, he's building Skilly, deploying AI agents you onboard and train like employees, not software you install. Adam, welcome to the Dark Arts.
hey guys, thanks so much for having me. Really looking forward to it.
You've been through 3 acquisitions. All those 3 companies had teams, people actually doing the work. So kind of take us through what actually happens to those teams when a company gets swallowed by a larger one.
Yeah, thanks guys for asking. So it's worth noting first and foremost that, it's a whole army that gets acquired on the back of some intersection of luckiness and smarts and all that good stuff. And so if I think about the types of business that I've been in, and I'm actually not smart enough to do a business to consumer business. I always have to do B2B. I think that's like the playbook to start with and end with. But what's interesting is when you're thinking about framing a problem, a lot of people take on this venture mindset, right? They ask themselves, what could I build to be big enough that will return, let's call it $1 billion. Although these days, maybe there's decacorns and all kinds of other lingo out there. By the time you start picking up momentum, it's this interesting duality that happens with a team. You basically have to decide if you're going to build a team that is 200 people big or 2,000 people big, or ultimately look for some big acquire. So I've been a little bit of a misfit toy in my career. I've been lucky enough to sit the early stage company when I've been leading business development. I've been on the product side. I've been sort of all the amalgamations thereof. We think about is oftentimes product, people, and if nothing else, really luck and timing. So the people is obviously the lifeblood of most organizations. It's rarely the case where an early stage company kind of gets it because it just won a patent or it necessarily stumbled into the right market at the right time. It's normally some version of a deadlift, right? You can pick your metaphor, like all the fuel gets absorbed in the beginning phases of a rocket launching. I found that to be both physically, emotionally, and mentally true. It's a repeat startup, instigator along the way. But what they don't always tell you is that oftentimes there's someone who's thought about this process a lot longer than you have. And so if I go back to my earliest days in the career, I had absolutely no idea how to think about capital optimization, how to think about layers and spans. I was a bit of a wind-up toy. So if we go back to the very beginning, like on the business development side, a lot of what you're thinking about is healthy and sustainable growth. Because even though you're achieving very short-term milestones, much of what someone's acquiring is long-term shareholder value. And that was a hard moment for me to cross over because when you're thinking in terms of weeks to months to maybe quarters in terms of things like quotas or limits, and then you move into a much larger organization, it changes the relationship cycles, it changes the depth of relationship. And so you go from months to quarters to oftentimes years and teams as opposed to kind of individual contributors. And so one of the first things we think a lot about, and I've thought about doing in these integrations, is actually asking myself, do we have a product or do we have a distribution opportunity? So sometimes you bring a wonderful product, it stands out, it kind of rings all the bells, everybody wants to come to it. The challenge with that wonderful moment is that you could be a little bit of a bright, shiny object. And so if you can't sustain and kind of integrate in that culture with a much larger machine, then you never get the advantage of distribution. Now, on the other end, right, if it's just a little bit of iterative and incremental kind of blessing that you're bringing to a company, even if you do the world's best job integrating, the distribution's again going to kind of treat you as a one and done, and you're never going to be part of the enterprise piece. And so, when you're thinking about the revenue side, oftentimes it's all about understanding distribution versus differentiation. Not that you don't want both. When I've been on the kind of nerdier side, right, kind of leading product and how it fits, the reality of it is you're often trying to basically battle first and foremost that no one internally could do this thing, right? I know a lot of people think about all the alternatives to you, direct, indirect competitors, analogs, and all that good stuff. But the reality is now more than ever with AI, the number one competitor you have is either don't do it because we're scared or do it internally because somebody rose their head up and just told you they could, kind of cloud code your app in a weekend. What you're then looking for is sort of strategy that supersedes kind of features, even if they roll into wonderful benefits. So, for instance, you have to be asking yourself, well, am I going to own the C suite of this industry or vertical? Like if I have this product space or this message, right? Am I going to be able to widen the number of people and the relationships I have if I ultimately get acquired? Because I'm no longer going to just serve, let's say, the business development teams or the ops teams or the finance teams, but can I actually serve across the number of them? If I'm lucky enough to kinda hit those 2 hurdles and still feel like we're acquirable, then I'm asking myself like, "Hey, what's the realistic and urgency and actionability that you can create about your idea?" And that kinda ties really closely with that nearly instant gratification we all wanna feel with return on investment. And then at the very bottom of that is the actual use cases and products. And why I say it in that kind of staggering order is because most people sort of think it's the reverse, right? They think, "Oh, I'm gonna acquire these features, these benefits, and I'm gonna run big marketing campaigns against it." But the reality of it is that most of the time, those are gonna be millions of dollars to maybe tens of millions of dollars of value created as opposed to hundreds, if not billions, right, that are coming on the extent after that. And obviously, with an acquisition, most people have a 5 to 10-year motion, not necessarily a 5 to 10-month motion.
How does it affect the people
Yeah,
ultimately?
well, first off, you said the C word, which is change, which affects everybody. And for the most part, sans, the entrepreneurs on the way out that have had their kind of liquidity, it oftentimes at least brings a lot of uncertainty. And while I don't agree with many life coaches on a lot of things, certainty is a really heck of a brilliant thing to bring to any situation, especially when you're early stage high growth. I think today it's also an added kind of extra complex component because it used to be that, there was someone in your place or you were going to be in that place, or they were going to combine you together, then to create something brilliant. And so that created this kind of this person to person change management dynamic. Now we actually have a person to person to machine or person to person to AI dynamic. And that's creating all sorts of wonderful and interesting, but kind of challenging acquisition and integration dynamics. Because, if you were the person who kind of kept this machine kind of floating with maybe legacy tech or kind of been there, done there, or, you've carried the metaphor, you could like knock on the machine and know where it's broken. You don't know if you're getting kind of cloned and copied on the way into an integration. You don't know if you're being propped up and elevated. The way you work with people is going to be the way you work with those people who own systems of machines or AI. And so, it's always an exciting moment if you have a cautious optimism like most entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial thinking people do. But the reality of it is, it's no longer about substitution or replacement, it's about augmentation. You package all that up, and the sort of look of fear in the eye, I called that kind of deer in headlights moment, is also about native AI ways of working. So, it used to be, I just saw a really interesting kind of grid that came out about what are the expectations of a product manager at an automation company called Zapier, right? And, it was sort of on the left end, I don't remember the exact color coding they did, but let's assume it was like danger, orange, red, right? And it was like, you're basically an exceptionally good product manager. And on the right-hand side, it's like, well, we really like to hire a product manager that was a CTO that also is really good at HR, that can build complicated systems, is also a data scientist. And I think it's wild to see that stretching because while we recognize that people are not going to be so vertically shaped in what they do, you've heard those expressions like V-shaped or T-shaped. Well, the reality of it is, though, is that being V or T shaped is typically not polarizing functional responsibilities, right? But you introduce roles like go to market engineering or forward deployed engineers, right? Then all of a sudden, what was a really technical person is now doing kind of customer success meets account management meets a little bit of tinkering and R&D. By the way, all in the moment where someone may or may not have really help them kind of become part and one with that client relationship. So what we're seeing here is not only is there change management necessary to really understand and uncover the talent in the individual, but it's the idea of how that individual is going to scale with systems that they either created or they didn't. And so what we're seeing is there's a lot more interest in terms of integration, like this my fellow kind of entrepreneurs and builders, in terms of acquihires kind of brought on a wholly different term because you're now acquiring alternative intelligence with human intelligence that are all wrapped in systems. So really the same mechanics at a high level around integration and sort of honoring talent and really helping change management is the number one value creator. But it's a uniquely complex moment because you used to be able to map, person to person, manager to manager, leader to leader. And now those are at least conflated, if not big expectations of you being multifunctional, almost like a Swiss Army knife.
And it's like, what kind of challenges, I guess, do you see in actually integrating humans with AIs in these sorts of situations? Because I feel like for a lot of people, right, it's really scary, not just the acquisition to begin with, but now that like their roles changing and now they have to work with AI and like that's their teammate. And that I think changes the dynamic of the team, obviously, right? But also like psychologically how you're now going to be working with a non-human.
Like all change management, I mean, you guys are really the experts on this, but the reality of it is it's what you do proactively, not reactively, that largely dictates your success in any form of combination, integration, consolidation, right? It doesn't always have to be an external force, right? I mean, they talk about these concepts like a digital attacker where you sort of self disrupt, right? You kind of bring the AI or whatever the enabler of the day is into your business so that you create the digital only bank to disrupt your brick and mortar bank, right? You create the mobile healthcare delivery system so that your academic hospital is not left in the dust for all these kind of adjacent kind of IoT like disruptive ideas. I think what you're going to find though, it's all about kind of ways of working going in, but it's also about how the company is investing in those ways of working, right? Most of us have gotten to some point in our career where we don't need to necessarily, out of compulsion, learn yet another system. Customer relationship management is kind of the ultimate like arc evil villain here, right? Like, I don't know a single salesperson that likes to put their data into a system, despite it be literally the way you get paid most of the time, right? Set quotas, enter data, maintain kind of institutional knowledge. Well, that's because a lot of times, like the incentives are not aligned, right? Like that function, that system, that tool is for the benefit of people that are abstracted out of your day to day and largely don't share risk or reward in the same way that you do. See, I think that's a little different with AI, right? I think the reality of it is that AI has really become this place that fills in the gaps in me and amplifies the opportunities and sort of the great things about you as an individual. And so no longer are we kind of taking a part of me and putting it in a software system. We're kind of augmenting me with bionic arms and kind of extensible thinking. What that means, though, and there's some really good case studies out here, is that you can't start by saying everybody needs to be an expert. Ultimately, the biggest risk most people have is going from a I'm scared of AI to I'm okay with AI to I love AI to I can't imagine how I ever existed without AI. But that motion is going to be very different by industry and maturity of company and function. If you're in product, yeah, there's all this amazing AI augmentation, but you still have to know the customer at the center. If I was sitting in an accounting or like an FP&A group and I was trying to predict and forecast in very structured spreadsheets, I'd probably feel a little differently about someone coming in and being like, could you just let this AI watch what you do every day and every week and every quarter as you reconcile the books? So I think we're seeing a little bit in that. I think the other part, and I'll sort of share a little anecdote about Skilly here. For instance, we have AI Fridays, right? Now we're a small and nimble team, like many venture-backed businesses are. I know you guys can, relate to this. It's kind of a high-growth business. But the reality of it is that we already have people that are pretty technically savvy. So, we're not going to basically force, Microsoft Copilot on anyone. We have a lot of
Agreed.
autonomy and agency is sort of what we choose. We've kind of done all the fundamentals in terms of offering like AI benefits. And I'm not saying you have to have 5 subscriptions a month, but I'm saying most people take advantage of the fact that like, they don't want to do things manually and in a repetitive and redundant way. But what we do on AI Fridays is actually give people and invest in people like micro R&D to kind of reinvent who they are and what they are doing with the safety net to realize that they're in charge of their own kind of innovation cycles. So, if you're in product, it might start with like simple and intelligent automations, right? We might say, hey, why don't you experiment with Claude Chat and let's put that in cowork. Let's hook up a couple things. Let's bring a couple of these processes from 12 manual steps to 3 manual steps where the judgment still relies on you. Because we never let anybody off the hook for just letting the AI mail it in. On more extreme end, right? It's hard to imagine now engineering teams not being at least empowered or supported by some version of cloud agents, no matter if they call them that or not. But it might be that we start a little slower. So, for instance, on some of our more junior developers and engineers, we might say, hey, listen, try not to focus on some of these really complex architectural patterns and kind of stay away from like, scale, stability, and security, but focus on like automating like functional or like unit tests, right? Hey, it's like, let's proxy this with screenshots to be a really good QA or tester to kind of give you that experience. Hey, let's introduce you to synthetic data and understand how to experiment with this model versus that model for this use case versus that use case. But the big thing is if I wait until after the disruption had already happened, I said, look at what these great people are doing. We know how to catch up. Everyone's going to feel threatened and I'm gonna get all those stress chemicals, right? I'm gonna get cortisol and adrenaline. I'm not getting serotonin and oxytocin, right? With all those great inspirational memories. And so the way we handle it on a really small scale is we actually invest in people to create kind of internal facing products, procedures, policies, whatever it might be, such that they can share with pride that they no longer have to do repetitive, redundant things. There's always going to be a percentage of the folks that don't want to change. And so let me be really clear to say the goal of, in our case, AI Fridays is to let the people that don't feel like they want to invest in their future have courageous conversations or be ambitious, find a better place for the fit, right? It's not a state of judgment. There's plenty of organizations for the next 10 years, foreseeably, maybe even more, that are going to be on a backwards facing moment. But they also have the infrastructure of 2,000 employees or 50 locations or, all sorts of guarantees and distribution advantages and all the kind of big stuff that a small company doesn't happen. But our places, we share in the open, we build in the open, and we actively invest almost a half a day a week in empowering people to try new things with the only real expectation of return being you share it in the open. And when you feel like you can screw up a little bit, you can build, you can spend a half a day doing something that never gets used, all of a sudden, yeah, sure, we throw away 17 of the 20 things, but welcome to product 102, right? The reality of it is I lose 17 out of 20 things already thanks to customer insight or changing market perspectives.
Yeah, it's like very similar almost to the back in the day. I don't know if they still do it, but I know at Google they had that free time for people to just kind of experiment. And I feel like sounds very similar, except the experimentation is around AI rather than just anything.
You know how the game goes, right? Like the 4-day work week is both really, really affected by every study and impossible for a lot of legacy managers to agree that people going to do this, hypothetical 5 days of work in four, right? Even though with all the context switching and the burnout and the time we spend on screens, like there's probably a lot of merit to that. People have tried no meeting Fridays, and I hear the spirit of that, but the reality of it is like it's good until it's not. And then in a small company, the reality of it is we need to talk at 2 o'clock on a Friday. Or if a client calls us because they don't care about our feelings at 4:45 p.m., Eastern time on a 5 o'clock close, like welcome to the second shift, right? I mean, that's the nature of creating something remarkable. The other reality though is that, unlike this kind of 20% time, and I don't mean to kind of comment so directly on it because I've never been an employee of Google and I don't really know what they did in that time. But in our world, the other part of this is it's collaborative. The idea is, multi and interdisciplinary thinking is kind of the bedrock of design thinking and kind of creating nonlinear innovation and value. And that means that we don't just let the engineers operate in a pocket, right? We have our marketing and comms person next to our chief commercial officer with our lead data scientist, right? We have our CTO with our head of business development, with someone who's running events for us, on offline activation. We really try to pair the problems in ways that bring diversity and not just backgrounds, but ultimately thinking about how to create value. Because the truth be told with AI, I'd call anybody a liar that says there's one use case for one tool in one way, right? Turns out if you do a wonderful job communicating or using AI to communicate or find efficiency as an operator in operations, probably someone in finance cares about it, someone in engineering cares, as even as lowly CEOs try to get on the plan from time to time and figure out, what's going on as well.
The teaching that you do, right, in business school and in computer science and AI and human computer interaction, right? And a lot of engineering teams, especially more legacy, I would think, and less of who you're working with, maybe are siloed, right? What you were just talking about, right? They're just completely set off. And I think that's becoming quickly an older way of operating. But it's still out there and it's always going to be out there to a certain degree. So do you think that's just a training issue, right? And that's something that can just be taught. And is that I'm sure that's something that you talk about in the classroom and at Skilly. So I'd just love to know a little bit more around that.
At the end of the day, I talked a little bit about kind of like V and T shaped people, right? That sort of branch out up above. I think you could also flip that why upside down and recognize that a lot of kind of fundamental early career skills, things that maybe you or I would have experienced over a 2 to 5 year kind of onboarding to our careers, are not kind of baked in the cake and kind of jump to the front of the line. For a lot of the stuff, you'd have to go and get someone who is maybe more junior, early career, or kind of more functional to kind of jump in for you. So I think first and foremost, the biggest lesson we talk about is not actually about silos. It's about not alienating people that have invested their career with subject matter expertise in a way that's complementary to yours, just because you could do the easiest 60% of their job, right? There's that joke that, a CEO doesn't make like $1 million a year. They make $100,000 10 days a year. And that's sort of the thing that we've discovered at both Skilly and frankly, my teaching at Carnegie Mellon is that, hey, yes, can Claude Code or insert the blank, whatever comes next, sort of fill in the fundamental thing or the great working with this data or the analyzing this or whatever the situation is, that's great. But it's the exception that finds the significant loss or the incredible value that you want to create. And most of the time, listening and that human expertise is actually where the unfair advantage lives. And so what we found is that when somebody has the opportunity to say, hey, I know I've been asking you for this, we facilitate a conversation about job swapping. So, a job description used to be very verticalized, right? Like, I am a marketer. Your job is to acquire attention. These are the skills and all the performative attributes we tell everybody to have, self-starting, et cetera, et cetera. Somewhere in the base or woven in that is like tooling. Largely, there's AI tools in there. What used to be marketing or operations or finance is just no longer defined in those same terms, right? I would argue the gap between classically defined engineering and product is conflating by the day, right? You can argue that like a religious war one way or the other, but the reality of it is that if I can get to the point of aggressive wireframes, right? Then I don't need some of the steps that I had, but I do need to understand where I got it wrong. Because as wonderful as AI is to move fast and break stuff or pick your kind of cliche or fortune cookie these days, it's not about the 9 out of 10 things it gets right, it's the catastrophic one it gets wrong, and we see this in engineering all the time. We have all sorts of human in the loop kinds of moments to evaluate logic and architectural patterns because, wow, insert the blank, your cursors, your Claudes, your codexes, like whatever is gonna be next comes and does a great job most of the time. Chances are, 1, it's messed with something that it didn't mess with before when you do a big build, right? And the second thing is that it has absolutely no context for what the customer just said yesterday or what the industry report that came out, last Friday really frames or the regulation of the policies that are going to shift. And so we've moved a lot of our kind of silo thinking into kind of integrating job descriptions. And we put a lot of work in Skilly and not getting overly worried about exactly what your title is. Now, that's a luxury of being, a handful of people compared to tens of thousands of people for sure. But I think we're going to find that job descriptions used to be I hired you for X and then I take you up a ladder rate, right? Started as a manager of marketing, now you're a director of marketing, now you're a VP of marketing, and then you're a farmer, as the cliche goes. I'm just kidding. But like, it's sort of one of those. But the reality of it is we've remained really fluid. So you might start out as a marketing manager, but then you actually say, well, actually, I want to be more client centered. I want to be more part of their success or their account management. Hey, no problem. Let me illustrate for you what that job description looked like, what your job description looked like. And then we actually meld those two. And for a minute, we suspend the titles because titles are largely identity. Identity is a really hard thing. When it's wrapped in ego, it's a kind of undo in a short window. I mean, you guys halfway wrote the book on this kind of stuff. So it's like, hey, that's where we are. But never in my life did I think I would have dynamic job descriptions. I knew job descriptions would evolve. I knew the tooling would update. I knew the expectations would shift based on the health or the state of the business. But I never thought I would take, one ingredient over here, which is customer success, another ingredient over here, which is product marketing, a third ingredient over here, which is like basic analysis or data science, and merge them all into something completely new. And so what we do a lot of both in academia now, because people are becoming even more interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, as well as skilly, is we challenge each other to think about your career, not just as kind of this vertical ladder, because that is a rare air sort of reserved for the kind of Fortune 500, Global 2000 kind of structured businesses, but instead say, hey, how do we get you to be a company of one? Right? Because at the end of the day, like I am a company of Adam. Kyle is a company of Kyle, right? We rent our skills to whatever the entity is. And I found to fight like the treacherous attrition and kind of the temptation of going and kind of getting on one of these golden treadmills, the way I have to treat people's careers is no longer about vertical growth, but almost this like spiral of growth where I'm rotating you almost what used to be almost like a management program, just supercharged with AI from function to function, and no longer say, hey, you started as an accountant and I can't wait till you're a CFO. Hey, I'm so glad you're an engineer. I can't wait to see you as our CTO. And instead say, hey, I now have the ability to augment your skill set in half the time as long as you're willing to make yourself open to things like AI. And so, I have this wonderful, incredible new hire that's going to be starting. We just celebrated because he got his H-1B visa. So we're all like, dancing around these days. It's a little bit more of a touch and go kind of moment to sort of manage, the incredible global nature of talent. But I was thinking, he started and he kind of came in as like a traditional software engineer. And he's like, you know what, Adam, the truth is I just want to sell stuff. And I'm like, great. I want everyone here to sell stuff. I was like, this is an easy ask, right? But how are you going to contextualize? How are you going to do customer interviews? How are you going to do this, that, and whatever? Because if your path is to be a commercially minded product person, right? Even though you have a wonderfully technical background, I need to give you things like AI that can simulate those conversations. I need to give you shortcuts so you don't have to memorize all the shortcuts and keyboard keys, right, for Excel, right? I need to give you access to these things that I would otherwise not been able to give you, and that person's never leaving you. If you can mold your company to their career as opposed to their career to your company, right? That is the fastest path we're going to get to maybe not a one-person billion-dollar company, but maybe a 50-person billion-dollar company doesn't feel nearly as out of reach as it once was.
One of the things that's been kind of interesting in the past few podcasts that we've done is it seems that a common theme that's been emerging in terms of hiring and people is that the most important quality in a person now isn't necessarily their resume, where they went to school, their skills, but curiosity.
When you look at some of the kind of baseline stats, so this is a little bit of a sneak peek into things like graduate school and the like, which is always both a wonderful thing and a really contentious thing, depending on kind of how you calculate the return on your time and energy. Most employers, and this is kind of an MBA lens, right, are expecting kind of classically defined kind of leaders, management leaders, things like that, to be a lot more digitally native and kind of AI fluent. But it's interesting because they're actually desperately seeking soft skills, right? And it's funny, like I agree, curiosity is the case and it cures ageism, right? Because at the end of the day, I've never watched a more wonderful thing, which is people, let's say cliche wise, over the age of 50, who are curious, who are excited, who are engaged, absolutely rewind the time machine of their relevant skill set back into their early to mid 20s, maybe their early 30s when it really kind of popped, and be able to contribute as a completely superhero form because they have all the lived experience, they have all the relationships, and now they don't need to feel at arm's length by a lot of these like fast moving, sometimes very administrative or nuanced pieces. So there's no question that curiosity plays a career changing moment. I've just seen it a little bit later in the kind of biggest piece. What we are looking for is basically attention and soft skills. I cannot tell you how hard it is to get people to listen to the totality of a problem before either putting it into an LLM or to just immediately out of reflex give me the equation of like delving into something or M dashing their way into some response because they've been so trained that I put an answer in and it just starts streaming knowledge, right? Which is terrible role modeling for hard problems and complex problems. Like, if you're in a place like Skilly is, so the nuance in Skilly is, right? So our presentation layer feels a lot like a lot of the common modalities, chat bots, SMS, QR codes, URLs, things like that to access conversational agents. The hard part about what we do is that all of these agents actually know each other and they have sort of a LinkedIn of agents that they can connect seamlessly across, geographies or use cases or problems. Well, if I come to an engineer and I'm like, hey, I'd love to explain to you our business, and I get through like the first half a breath and I get to chatbots or agents or whatever they're calling them these days. And they're like, oh yeah, let me tell you about all these things. I was like, yeah, but you haven't actually heard the part that's hard or different or that's additive to like all the other like AI SDR kind of nonsense that was kind of plaguing us over the last year and a half. And so a lot of what we actually do in our interviews now is we test critical thinking in an analog setting, right? We ask people to sort of come with us in a variety of social settings that we, of course, pay for and subsidize. And there's a lot of these echoes in the urban legends of like watching the way people treat waiters, but candidly, it's now more important than it's ever been. We talk a lot and watch how people kind of brainstorm and iterate and kind of frame problems before they execute. Because once you've gotten clear instructions, then the automagical stuff happens, right? Like you can ship it off, you can triage, you can come it all together. And so, I love your kind of lead in here for curiosity. And that's the part that my heart sings for, especially as AI happens, for folks that have an incredible mountain of knowledge, but have not necessarily been able to keep up with all the bells and whistles. But on the kind of earlier career side, the more kind of native AI folks, my challenge is not that they can't learn the infinite number of tools or they can't orchestrate all these very insecure open claw variations and whatnot that I'm pretty sure only people that are selling YouTube courses actually talk about. I'm not sure anyone. I watched somebody the other day do a demo that was allegedly an expert and put their like Claude key on the screen in front of 60 people. And, my inner CISO just like melted on the spot. I was like, I hope no one's like recording this for like SOC 2 purposes or anything. But what I would say is soft skills, empathy, clarity, complex problem solving are much more universal now because I can teach you or give you something that knows almost everything in a functional capacity with like hundreds of dollars worth of tokens, right? I can't teach you to understand how to orchestrate a set of 2 or 3 people in a complementary way to really do a non-linear, kind of non-incremental problem-solving motion, right? Like, we don't work on transactional problems. Everything in my business is about transformational outcomes, so I don't get to just make a better UI for a mediocre chatbot, right? I don't get to wrap ChatGPT and just go out there and pretend like it's the next best thing. The types of problems I'm thinking about are, like, reinventing the horizontal way that people navigate the internet, right? I'm thinking a lot about what it looks like when every website is an AI guide that connects with every other AI guide, and we no longer need the Webflows and the WordPresses and the CMSs of the world, right? That is not a problem that a wonderful high IQ 25-year-old knows anything about. And if I just let them come in and I tested them purely on how they benchmark and how they are acute in their engineering skills, it'd be great if we had a linear future. But I don't know about you guys. Like, I have yet to predict what's happening next Tuesday in the AI land as opposed to, 3 Tuesdays from now or a year from now and all that good stuff.
Kind of touching on soft skills and people and learning and stuff. I feel like a lot of hirers, companies feel that that can't be taught ultimately. The soft skills, and that's, one of the things that I think we do pretty well at Hellenic is actually bring people in and teach them these soft skills, how to interact with other people, how to think beyond the product. I feel like that's, not to tout our own thing, but like ultimately an industry that's going to grow, you know? And I think it's also something that I'm surprised that schools themselves aren't already teaching.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, two kind of comments come to mind. I'd say one, that people are going to be more important than ever because the number of people, therefore, the importance of each failure point or growth point is just becoming 10x. It'll be 100x, eventually it'll be 1,000 or 10,000x. I mean, I don't know where technology is going to take us, but I really do believe at least some of the whispers in the wind about substantially small companies being very, very lucrative, right? Like, we look at sort of that kind of echo. I think it was like Block or Square that literally just like laid off 40% of its staff effectively overnight. And I know there's a bunch of the asterisks about maybe they overhired during the pandemic and the like, but no one can argue with me that that percentage of people is like trivial, right? I mean, not only not to make light of everyone's lives, but just like the volume of capacity coming in and capacity coming out is wild. So I actually believe that first and foremost, investing in soft skills and curiosity and attention and all these other things is going to be more important than it's ever been because you're going to count on each other in much smaller, concentrated groups that are much broader in the functional responsibilities. I would also say, we have a fun way. This is what I tell everybody at Carnegie Mellon. So students will come up to me and they're like wagging their tails and they're really excited. And they're like, Adam, you have experience, which is a nice way of them calling me an old entrepreneur, just for the record. They're like, hey, you've survived this. Like, what is this like? And I said, they're like, what did you do in the beginning? And they're expecting me to sit down and say, well, I programmed 18 hours a day and I did this stuff. And I say, listen, actually, it's really simple. I did 3 things to be a better operator, including how I apply those skills to technology. I said, the first one is I went out and took improv classes, and that's a little bit more of the gimme, right? I think if you're reading a blog post, eventually you find yourself in a place where everyone's like, oh, do improv because you get the yes and moment, and people could Google that or ChatGPT that if they're ready. But it's also about like making your partner successful. And that's really the crux of what I try to bring forward. There's a lot of radical individualism, both good and bad, right? That sort of capitalism honors. I think that it's wonderful to be able to have courageous conversations and big ambitious moves and not feel like someone can take your agency or your kind of accountability away. I think on the other side, it's very rare that a single human being gets it always right all the time. And if it's always about me, then it's never about we, and that's just a challenge, right? So the first thing I tell everybody is go do improv, right? I think the second thing, which is a little less surprising, is I say, hey, go do salsa dancing, right? If you can't be in close body contact with a gender that you find attractive and not make it romantic, awkward, or weird, man, you're going to really, really struggle to make authentic connections because people are going to come in from all places and spaces. And when you're early in your life, if you've chosen to think about relationships in any kind of predictable way, oftentimes it's very top of mind in like your 20s and 30s. But it's oftentimes like, thankfully, we have very diverse workforces. We should have more diverse workforces. But the reality of it is, you need to know how to have close body contact and be appropriate and thoughtful and respectful of spaces and things like that. And I say that from a place of someone who's like very neurodivergent because it's not like people don't have the will to have emotional intelligence in a significant way. But if you've been sort of operating inside of your head, if you've been kind of isolated in a way where success or failure was about the score you got on a test, oftentimes you haven't been taught that everyone is accessible and vice versa. But more importantly, a lot of the kids at Carnegie Mellon are lucky enough to come from a place of at least lots of choice and optionality, if not privilege. And if you've never been with anyone who's differently able from a different socioeconomic strata, you just don't know how to build a big business. We say this all the time at Skilly that if we can't sell Skilly in a Walmart parking lot, then it's never going to be the business that we want it to be in terms of impact or scale. And the last one is actually the last piece of advice I give one, and this is kind of what gets on all the students' nerds. I always say you have to volunteer at least 4 to 6 hours a week with real people. And I don't mean like performatively coming up and wearing your t-shirt so you can get one of those awkward pictures, as part of like a United Way campaign. I mean, like getting your hands dirty, working with real people in real circumstances and not believing you're better than them. And I think that is so hard. It's easy for me to understand as like a lowly country kid that came from nowhere and then like landed in a city on accident. But I wasn't born in one of these bougie vests, right? Like I was born like cleaning up trash and working manual jobs and doing all kinds of things while also taking apart and putting back together computers. But if you don't understand like the struggles, the needs, the goals, the objectives, just the tension, headwinds, and tailwinds that come with a normal person, you're never going to be an exceptionally good problem solver because you cannot rotate enough angles. You can't interact with enough people in a platonic and impactful way. And you can't admit to yourself fast enough that you're just not going to be the hero in every play, right? You can't always be the main character, as the kids are saying, right? And I think that's really critical. When I think about how that translates to Skilly, like we serve a lot of human services and nonprofit clients. Now, you'll be shocked to hear that that is not the number one vertical that, investors flock around, but it's really critical to us, those are recycled entrepreneurs, because one, and first and foremost, like nonprofit is the third biggest employer in the country, right? And if you look at just like my little neck of the woods, I'm in kind of southwestern Pennsylvania, there's like 8,500 nonprofits for good, bad, or nothing, right? That are in this kind of 12 county area. And that's not counting, clubs like 4-H and other stuff that's kind of in the peripheral there, right? Before anyone's allowed to write a single line of code, whether you're commanding an agent to do it or otherwise, you got to go volunteer. You got to show up. Like we have a wonderful opportunity to support a recovery center, does a lot of really good work in terms of helping people that have made really positive choices in their life to kind of continuously improve. Well, I'm bringing my, hard-hitting AI ML engineers to this place because I don't want to hear that you're capable of building something, having never actually experienced what someone will do on the receiving end of our technology, right? Because if our AI feels like an entitled jerk, right, and it doesn't relate in the same way that, any of you guys could, right, to everyone, then it's never going to be a great product. It's going to be a perfectly academically wonderful thing on a PowerPoint slide or Google slide, and it's never going to go anywhere.
Kind of shifting gears a tiny bit, but not really, I guess, but I just kind of want to get a little bit more into what Skilly does. And, like you've said that like with 3 days of training, an AI employee is about as good as a 3-month human.
Better than that now, I mean, listen, in real time and near time, as we are getting into it.
That was a
Okay,
week
should I
ago.
give you the real story or the funny story? The one that sound the honest one or the funny one? Because let me tell you right now, no actual startup idea in my entire life has come with absolute intention. It's been something that kind of, hit me in my forehead in the middle of me wondering why everything is broken. So, should I give you a little bit of the history?
Yeah, I would love. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so, us
Both
early.
the funny story and the real one,
Yeah,
ideally.
yeah, of course, of course. Yeah, yeah. So listen, us lowly professors, oftentimes I thought of, I actually legitimately have to confess that I do own suits with like elbow patches on the corner. That was actually a moment in my life. But a lot of times I talk during winter over the years. Anyways, one of the things that professors can do is run what's called executive education programs. So this is largely quite late stage career professionals they're coming back in for very typically very targeted kind of credentialing, kind of additive work that very much is on focus, and it's much more niche and customized than kind of a classic MBA that's a number of classes wide to give you an exposure. One of the executive education programs I taught for a number of years was actually something called Cloud Advisors with this wonderful man named Dr. Maj Saker, who I think now is the chief learning officer over at Accenture. But what would happen with Maj and I is we would first and foremost bring a lot of these wonderful executives in town. And our primary goal was actually to teach them about ways to talk about cloud and multi-cloud and what was happening in storage and all kinds of nerdy things to give them maybe a little bit of an advantage. But one of the other opportunities that was surfaced during this exec ed is that if you're a very technical leader, like you understand how to shift 2,000 virtual machines from point A to point B or pick your clouds or whatever, you may be really excellent at talking to a chief technology or information officer. You might be pretty mediocre at talking to a chief marketing officer. And if you think about some of the early trends, and based on the industry, this shifts, but CMOs buy a lot of technology and data these days, right? Especially in the realm of AI. And so one of the things that Maj and I talked about was like, should we give everybody an opportunity to practice and sort of figure out how to communicate to non-technical leadership? So I wrote this module, over a course of cycles called Hostile Frequently Asked Questions or Hostile FAQs. And the premise, just to kind of cut you with a couple of sound bites here, it's like, hey, first impressions are really important, but last impressions are forever. And someone said that to me once and it just hit me. I was like, "Oh, wow." And then I started researching about Q&A, and it turns out that like the majority of people have all of their influence and their recall in like the last 5 minutes of a 45-minute meeting because that's when they finally get to ask the questions that they care about. It's when they finally get to surface the stuff that's actually blocking them from saying like yes or no. And maybe that feels obvious to everybody else in hindsight, but it was not a thing that was kind of on the tip of my tongue, having both been a revenue leader but also a product person and how it came together. So we did this exercise. So I made everybody write down a bunch of questions that they were getting from potential clients. Some clients were selling $5,000 buckets of software. Some people were selling $50 million consulting agreements. It was a really broad range. So they write down these questions and I would ask them, well, how frequently do you get this question and how important do you get this question? Or how important is this question to kind of you being successful? Scale of 1 to 5. Great. No problem. Question, frequency, importance. And I said, okay, well, why don't you write down the answer? Tell me how confident you are in this answer and how differentiated you think this answer is compared to the way every one of your competitors would say it. Now, this is the part that I think us jokers know what's coming because, of course, the ratings for the companies that came were like, on average, I think it was like 4.25 or 4.4 out of 5 in terms of differentiation. I turned those same answers over to qualified buyers and ran this study, and the average score was like 2 out of 5. Right? Now, to give you some context, right? 1 out of 5 is like you have a pulse that exists around a market problem, right? 2 out of 5 is like you're probably not going to get sued if you hire this person. They definitely have a B or better in the Better Business Bureau. 3 is probably like table stakes, right? It's best in class, best practice. But, if I use a wonderful example around, let's say, consulting, because I mentioned Accenture earlier, like, if Accenture can say it, there's a lot of really good consulting firms that compete with places like Accenture. And so we might argue that if Accenture feels that like a case study is really brilliant, maybe that other firm actually also has a case study, right? So in full disclosure, it's not because you don't have great stuff to be out of 3 out of 5. It's just that everybody has great stuff. By the time you get to a 4 out of 5, right, you really are in pretty rare air about what you can say, and you are objectively leading with differentiation. And at 5, you're standing at the top of the mountain, and in a rare moment, you can say something that no one else on the planet can say. And that is about as rare as it sounds, right? Now, all those things are caveated by the fact that execution, relationships, a million factors play into why someone can be successful commercially. But this foundation allowed us to kind of write down these questions and answers, test them. And over time, I really accidentally created this amazing seed data set of when somebody had a question, the iterations about how they changed the answer, and if they actually made a sale because they iterated the answers all in this guise. Now, that data set probably feels obvious, but it's actually really hard to aggregate across like hundreds of organizations over multiple years and people that are buying services and software and healthcare and manufacturing and forestry and mining. So we jammed all this stuff together. And what became really obvious to me is that there's a handful of question types and a lot of really important pairing of answer templates, such that if somebody asks a question, like an open-ended question or a yes and no question that sometimes nerds call binary or polar, and I answered one way, maybe it's brief or long, maybe it's scientifically based or emotive, right? Which of those pairings, went from kind of peanut butter and jelly to like peanut butter and chocolate, right? And so over the course of this 4.5 years, I studied how answer patterns match to questions to create urgency. And what we observed through our kind of wonderful kind of colleagues that were coming through in the real world scenarios is that if you applied this kind of language pattern in these methods, somebody would make a decision about 40% faster. Now, it can't get you always a yes or a no, right? But if you have
Hmm.
a 10-month enterprise sales cycle, getting an answer in 6 months is like a non trivial thing.
Yeah.
Now, just in that serendipitous moment, everybody around the entire CMU ecosystem was like yammering at everyone else's ear, but like, hey, do you know what's coming? Do you know what's coming? And it was sort of the early winklings of these kind of like generative AI moments where you're going to finally have the ability to have a conversational interface with your computer, which sounds wonderful to all of us native folks. But the reality of it is that's a pretty big difference in the way most people use their computer. So I took all of these logic and these tunings and these ways in this data set that nobody else had validated with actual outcomes. And I embedded this DNA inside of our first conversational agent that I want to say was in the kind of early to mid kind of 2024 area in terms of where we were. Now, bear with me because, it's easy to retrofit success overnight, but the truth is that, I'm in a moving target business, right? There's new models, there's new methods, there's new regulations kind of every day. But, Skilly really started before it became ubiquitous of having a wonderful kind of front door or storefront to all your digital properties to answer questions with specific intention of creating an outcome. See, a lot of the kind of 9.99 wrappers, forgetting all the privacy, security, scale stuff of like wrapping ChatGPT or whatever, are perfectly good if you have like a basic RAG pipeline with really structured data that never changes and you have an audience that just loves you. Turns out that is not what everybody gets, right? You get a bunch of like haters and kind of, raving fans, and you don't always get as much in the middle as everybody wants to pretend. So we took this logic and we put it inside of these agents, and then we allowed the agents to have tons of personalities. And, like you guys have deep roots in sort of the way of kind of creating change, right? Like I had 10 or 15 years of really understanding how the internet does more personalized marketing and kind of finds identity and kind of manage all these content. So we got really, really good at having agents that in a really little amount of time, like an hour for 3 months, about 10 hours for 6 to 9. And if you get the whole way to 20 hours, you're probably cracking over a 12-month worth of experience in an employee, could not only have wonderful conversations, but also get you to a place that was mutually agreed as a wonderful thing for you and the business. Because a lot of the old like intent models that were like big upside down decision trees, a lot of the early inference models that were, sycophantic as we think of it today, but sort of over editorialized and kind of romanticized. It was like meeting a Shakespearean actor every time you like went to a chat. But it's like, let me tell you another thing that you should know, and another thing. The reality of it is like that's not what people want. So our agents kind of build the tension between empathetically qualifying and being Socratic and curious about why you're here to create value without imposing that you like give a DNA sample and an email address and a phone number, which none of us like, just at a human level. So then being able to really work backwards from an outcome, whether that was downloads or sales or appointment settings and the like. And that became kind of the foundation. Now, if I'm confessing, that's kind of the boring part in Nerdland of what we were building, but it was a necessary and kind of timely moment because people had like decades of trauma based on terrible chatbots that they've been exposed to. Like, I couldn't really name a single chatbot that I was like, well, that was a wonderful experience that I got. There wasn't at least a human behind the chatbot. I mean, there's been some fun exceptions, but that's about it. So we started asking ourselves questions about like, well, why is it that like I have you guys that we can network with and we can be connected on LinkedIn, but why are these AI guys not connected to everybody else? Because it turns out if you own a dog and you're a pet owner, yeah, you want to go to the pet hotel and talk to that agent and figure out if your dog can be there and what their standards are and all that good stuff. But then I'm not really that pet hotel is not really competitive with like dog walkers and dog food and like pet insurance and like. And why are we treating everything like single searches where we were like casting a rod? And by the way, they're amazing. Like we love Perplexity and ChatGPT and Claude and all their various browsers for good and bad, right, that have come out. But it's sort of a faster horse, right? It's like taking people that are good at articulating a search, curating a lot of noise for them and bringing it together. But it doesn't really bring you from like one experience to the next to kind of complete your I own a dog journey. And so that's what we started embedding in our AI guides, right? So you go to a university like Carnegie Mellon, because we run their Tepper School of Admissions agent, right? I just want to bring my parents this weekend, which is not an uncommon thing, or alumni visit. Well, instead of Carnegie Mellon having to have a world of knowledge and it'd be very mediocre and listicle rich of like what to do in Pittsburgh. Now, when somebody asks that, their AI guide just hands off to the Visit Pittsburgh guide, which is our destination marketing org here in Southwestern PA, and it makes a connection seamlessly. It hands off that context from agent one to agent two and doesn't burden either organization trying to do things that they're not really exceptional at. Now, to you and I, that's wonderful because I don't really want Carnegie Mellon to tell me where I should take my kids or take my dog to walk or anything in Pittsburgh. But I definitely don't want Visit Pittsburgh telling me how to do negative binomial regression in the School of Computer Science, right? There's a two-way street here that's got to be met. And then, the fun part about Skilly is we started building these like really big guide and conversational directories. So if you go to a place like morepowertogether.org, you're going to find almost 700 nonprofit AI guides that all work together because unfortunately, and this is really common even in places like Pittsburgh, if you're in a little bit of need or just need a little bit of help, you oftentimes have to go to like 15 to 20 different organizations to kind of get your pillars covered, right? Pillars being like housing and food and workforce and transportation and school and all kinds of really important things that we all need at some point. Like we should be way less judgmental of someone that needs a little bit of help. It's good for them. It's good for us to get them over the line. But if you think about it, how would I find or how would I do a perplexity search given my digital literacy of, hey, I am really struggling right now. Can you give me a bunch of nonprofits that can help me? Right? That kind of intelligence that you and I would think is second nature because once we've met, I'm like, okay, cool. I'll call this person for people help and this person for whatever. These guides take on that network association. The third kind of component that we think a lot about is how do consumers, right, which we're kind of coming up to here, how do they have a common inbox for all their chatbots? That sounds silly because we have an inbox for our text and SMS messages. We have an inbox for our email. Where is your inbox for all the chatbot messages you ever had across many, many brands? And so that simple concept of having a consolidated inbox where when you talk to Carnegie Mellon or Visit Pittsburgh or a nonprofit or the Arizona Tech Council or whatever it is that kind of runs these AI guides, where does all that stuff live so you can continuously engage, you can come back to them, you can text them whenever you're ready. And those kind of evolutions have been all leading up to this idea that we want to incentivize in kind of a new contextual kind of affiliate network your ability to put your guide on somebody else's website because we've always thought of websites as like single brand, right? But if I think about like the Area Agency on Aging that I mentioned, it's a wonderful organization, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people they serve over the age of 60. Not all of it is about socioeconomic strata. There's lots of wonderful life enriching things that they do, but they have like 40 different living facilities under contract, right? Well, each one of those living facilities has questions about offerings and services and the like. And so if you send somebody into the inbox that has kind of the empty bottom, right? They have to put somebody in a call center with a wait time of 20 plus minutes. Or they can just ask their digital employee to show up for work at somebody else's office, AKA a website. And as we start to kind of rewire the horizontal kind of customer journey of the web, Skilly is really trying in a very, very privacy centric way, meaning not doing all kinds of sneaky stuff to nail your browser and kind of figure out who you are behind the scenes, but to really support a person going on journeys with a destination and not kind of keeping us again in that kind of infinite search cycle where we know less and less about how the decisions are being made about what comes in front of us. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yep. 100%. And it sounds amazing. So congratulations. And I actually just wanted to kind of,
Yeah,
yeah, that's it. Yeah. I want to know more. I feel like we're just scratching the surface, but I know we are kind of coming up against
I don't want
time
to like
because you are. So do you still run retreats on your farm for founders and for early
I
stage?
do. Yeah, yeah. So I don't know if anyone has ever had a father or a loved one that was in like a blue collar field for a really long time and like work is their identity. But I will tell you, I love my father deeply. But when he decided to kind of exit his own entrepreneurial journey, you don't know what to do with a guy that ran like heavy equipment for like 50 years, right? So yeah, to Kyle's point, a few years ago, I bought a 165-year-old. I never got comfortable with this word yet, but it's I'm not really a functional farmer anymore, having grown up on one, so I can't really say that. But it's like a farmette, right? It's a property that has, a few dozen acres that allows you to kind of navigate and kind of put your feet on the grass. And one of the primary reasons I started teaching at Carnegie Mellon is because it was the most dense pool of future leaders that I was going to try to offer a little bit of my lessons learned so they didn't repeat the same mistakes I did, right? And hopefully they do much, much bigger and better things than I ever could. Well, on the other side of that, you're also starting to realize with AI technology, which is, a small little coaching kind of dynamic I have as like peer to peer, is that if you're gonna make decisions about how mortgages are approved or how logistics happen or, how anybody does anything with AI, I want you just to feel comfortable, like you can ask me what you would call the dumb questions in a quiet place so that you don't do dumb things in a public market, right? Say weird stuff, be a bad actor, whether it's intentional or not. And so I'm lucky enough that I do run pretty frequent retreats, especially as the weather gets a little nicer than it has been, Kyle. Like, I mean, it's close to a ski resort, but that's not really the primary thing. But I bring a lot of multi and interdisciplinary teams down together. But when I do that, it's typically like a CTO of a hardcore AI company. It's typically like an executive director of a really worthy, like longstanding nonprofit. It's traditionally someone who's like a very small business or an independent kind of contributor on their own kind of freelance journey. But I don't allow the echo chamber to be consistent because what I'm trying to remind everybody of is like the humanity still has to be at the center, right? Doesn't matter if it's Skilly AI guide, if it's a wonderful SaaS tool that's kind of bringing you into the 21st century. We still have to remember that we are human beings seeking a human experience. And now more than ever, the power to make consolidated decisions about really big systems is not only really large and enabled by AI, but it also happens sometimes really, really fast. And if you haven't been in a boardroom meeting recently, I will tell you that people are like, almost like that Salt Bay meme. They're just like, well, we'll put a little AI on it. Like, what's our AI strategy? And it's just like, man, I just hope that everybody can slow down to speed up, right?
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Well, and so the to kind of complete the question, so you're doing that, right? You're teaching, you're building Skilly. So you've got Mad Labs, right? Like you're all over the place, right? But still you have this intensity and energy. And so I would just like to know, like, is there a personal routine? Like, how do you avoid burning out yourself?
Yeah, well, so it's a lot more simple. This is a very parent frame, so everyone's got a bias, and this is mine. But I optimize most of my days about minimally having 4 hours with my kids. Because I will tell you, I will not be one of those cliches that, like, stops and the next day, like, heals over because they, like, did nothing but stress their heart out for 50 years. So what that means is I oftentimes have to get up at 4 or 5 in the morning. What that sometimes means is I have to get back to it at 9 o'clock at night, but I really get my battery charged. Law of averages, although parents know what I mean. But by seeing the creativity, like the wonderful expression of naiveness, right? Like all of these things come together in fruition because if you think that we are creative and curious and high intensity, well, talk to a 10 or 12. Their world is borderline sci-fi, what those of us have expected. I do a lot of the cliche stuff, right? Like I treat my mirror like an IDE and I program my brain. Like I talk myself through the day. I'm super organized. I mean, listen, I didn't mean to accidentally become a BCG person. It came through acquisition, but they are next level at helping you organize yourself and be efficient in a thoughtful way to balance the incredible expectations that people have when they are paying a premium to have, significant change. I also do a lot of hydration. And, I looked back at one point in all the autobiographies of people that have made it. And if we put all their labor law violations aside, the one common thread through most of them is they worked out for 30 minutes a day. And I've gotten really good. So I refuse to basically, if it is more than 50 degrees, I get my rear end on a bike and I bike to work, right? I walk to work. I take a bus a lot because it gives me thinking time where I physically can't be doing derivative elements of where I am. But I think more than anything, you talked about Mad Labs, which is an open source lab. The reality of it is that, like, I have open sourced about 1,000 hours of free design thinking kits, but I leave everybody with just one thing here, one exercise to do, other than come hang out with me at Skilly, is to do something called the 20-10-10 exercise. It's free, it's open, it's been done by tens of thousands of people over the last years. It's all about taking a self inventory of what is intrinsically and organically motivating for you to work on. And it's a method or a template of learning how to say no to things that don't matter. And really, I've just been more lucky than smart. Great relationships, wonderful wife, thank God, healthy kids. The reality, though, is I'm choosing my existence, which means that when I have a bad day or I get grumpy, I have to remind myself in that mirror, I chose this. Right. And so you can't choose something and be mad at yourself. Right. Like you can't be externally angry and be the only one that is the boss. Right. Which is the reason why, we're self funded at Skilly. There's a couple of us that have been through a few startups, right? So we've had a little luck along the way. But, we want to do the right thing. We want to bring AI at a massive scale and important problems. And that can't happen if I am the biggest victim of the change around me. That can't happen if I am the worst version of the example that I ask everybody to set. That can't happen if I don't know how to say no to things that don't have the same mission, vision, and goals that I do.
Yeah, dude, that's really powerful.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, this has been amazing.